North Korea?
Not a chance. This is just impulsive, ill thought out action that is unlikely to do anything but move us more toward a confrontation. This was not written by the National Security Council, H.R. McMaster. This is right off the top of his head in his hotel.
That is General Barry McCaffrey yesterday with Nicole, and just moments ago, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson landed in Guam on a scheduled refueling stop on the way back home. And despite some hot rhetoric from North Korea in response to President Trump, Secretary Tillerson said there is, quote, no imminent threat, and he told reporters this.
I think Americans should sleep well at night. I have no concerns about this particular rhetoric of the last few days. I think the president, again, as commander-in-chief, I think he felt it necessary to issue a very strong statement directly to North Korea. But I think what the president was just reaffirming is the United States has the capability to fully defend itself from any attack and defend our allies, and we will do so. And so the American people should sleep well at night.
Secretary Tillerson talking about the now specific threat against Guam from North Korea. Joining us now, ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland, and in Washington, former Secretary of Defense William Cohen. Gentlemen, welcome. We've got a lot of questions for you, starting with Joe.
Hey, Mr. Secretary, let's begin with you. You have obviously been immersed in this issue for quite some time. Barack Obama had told Donald Trump during the transition that North Korea was going to be one of his biggest problems, but this is a problem you were dealing with back in the 90s. Tell us what's happened and what we can expect moving forward.
Well, the North Koreans have simply accelerated their development and their goal to develop a nuclear capability, and one that can threaten the United States. But they are not suicidal, and this is the message that the president has sent, or should send in a way that doesn't sound, and I have to hyphenate the word, bombastic. That kind of language is not going to intimidate the North Koreans. To me, it's always better. You see an enemy that remains silent. That's more frightening than someone who is beating his chest or engaging in schoolyard banter or locker room language than to have a more powerful impact. So I think silence would have been very good here, and let the diplomats like Secretary Tillerson, let the others who are trying to bring about a peaceful solution to this have the authority to do so. But simply issuing threats, which the North Koreans are not going to take as serious, because they know intuitively, I think, that the United States is not going to launch a preemptive attack, putting at risk hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of South Koreans and Japanese and others. So I think we have to be careful of the rhetoric. Right. It doesn't push us closer, but I think it was pretty bombastic.
Mr. Secretary, if you could expand a little bit on your comments that North Korea is not suicidal. We in the West try to paint them as irrational, possibly suicidal, crazy. In fact, from their point of view, looking at what happened with Libya and Muammar Gaddafi when he gave up his weapons program, many believe that the North Koreans think the most suicidal approach would be not to develop nuclear weapons and be exposed to possibly having their regime overthrown. They see that as their protection against what happened to Gaddafi in Libya.
Well, if you go back to the Chinese strategist Sun Tzu, he said you must know your enemy, and to know your enemy, you must think like your enemy. I think we have to do more of that to understand what their goal is. Their goal is not to invite a nuclear holocaust. Their goal is to remain secure in perpetuity with a family, if they can, to develop their country, and hopefully they think one day to dominate the Korean Peninsula, whether by intimidation or by some sort of an agreement which takes down the barriers, where you can have a united Korea that is not militarized. Now, that may be pie in the sky, but they are not taking action to invite an attack by the United States. That is totally counterintuitive, certainly from our point, and I believe from theirs.
Senator Cardin, you were very critical of President Trump's comment yesterday, the fire and fury comment. You said they were not helpful. They show he lacks the temperament, you say, and judgment to deal with the serious crisis the United States confronts. Excuse me. What is your specific concern as it relates not to the president's temperament, but what it means for foreign policy and for the United States and national security?
Well, I think the international community is looking to the United States for leadership to avoid a military confrontation with North Korea that could well involve nuclear weapons. And what the president said was just not helpful, but also raises the question to the international community whether the United States has a game plan for North Korea in order to change the equations. So I think it was just the wrong message and elevated the situation rather than showing the international community that there is hope for a diplomatic solution.
It's now, Senator, a familiar refrain that there are no good options when it comes to North Korea. At this point, given what you've said, given the new rhetoric, and also the tests we've seen and the reports from NBC News that the North Korea does now have nuclear capability that can be attached to an ICBM, what is the best course of action for the United States right now?
I think the best course of action is to continue to work with the international community to change the equation, particularly for China. So China becomes much more engaged in working to get North Korea to at least freeze their program, to sit down and talk, to show that there's a path forward. And I agree with the Secretary. I think what the North Koreans want is to preserve their regime. China also wants to preserve that type of regime in North Korea. So we should have a common agenda with China to ease back on the current situation in North Korea.
David Ignatius?
I want to ask Secretary Cohen, Mr. Secretary, without divulging things that were classified, give us a sense. We always talk about how bad the military options are in dealing with North Korea. You've looked carefully at this. Give us a sense of the options and why they trouble people who look at them.
Well, as we know, that the North Koreans have as many as 15, 20,000 artillery capability about 40 miles, 45 miles from downtown Seoul. They could rain Seoul with these missiles and destroy it in a matter of a few hours or days if necessary. They also have nuclear weapons which are buried deep in their territory, hard to detect, hard to get at. So the notion that we would launch a preemptive attack thinking that we could wipe them out before they could strike, I think is foolhardy. And that is one of the reasons why the military commanders have never, in my judgment, ever advocated that we take a preemptive military strike against the North Koreans. If we're trying to send a signal to the Chinese and to others, what we ought to do is call the South Korean President, Moon, and say, put the THAAD missile system back on track. You suspended it. Put it back on track. That gives you some defensive capability. Go to the Japanese and say, perhaps it's time for you to have the THAAD system there as well. Start doing those things in conjunction with the sanctions that have just been voted upon and start squeezing the North Koreans and saying, it's going to get tougher for you. We're going to make it very hard for you to be able to continue this testing and having the resources to do it. And then maybe they'll be in a mood at that point with the help of the Chinese and the Russians to say, let's get back to the table so we can solve this, because the United States should be determined to squeeze like a python the North Koreans and saying, we're going to continue this on a non-military basis, but make it very painful for you to continue in the way you're doing. I think the notion that the military is now accelerating their planning for a military attack, we've always had plans for what if we have to go first? What if we have to respond? So that's not something new. And I think Secretary Tillerson's comments are just the right ones. Let's take a deep breath. Let's rest easy at night. We have a capability of deterrence and destructive capability second to none. We don't have to worry to the point where we become hysterical of what the next move is by them or what we're going to say in response to what they're doing.
Senator Cardin, Andrea Mitchell's initial reporting earlier this morning indicates that Defense, the NSC, as well as the Chief of Staff had very little input, if any, into the President's statement issued yesterday. So that leaves three generals with knowledge of the military, knowledge of foreign affairs, sort of out of the loop, according to this reporting. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think this is how President Trump operates, and I think it's very unfortunate. It's not the way you should be conducting foreign policy. As Secretary Cohen said, there's not really a good military option here. The best option is to continue a process in which we isolate North Korea and change the equations, particularly for China and Russia, to help us to avoid this type of a military confrontation. That's our best strategy. And what